Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Grace, for your very informative presentation. So Mary and I are both members of the RBA's Education Advisory Panel and have been tasked with talking with you today. It's a privilege being able to meet with educators from right around Australia, because I think so often we're very state-based, but it also presented us with an interesting challenge because largely economics is focused in the senior years, and it turns out every state has fairly different curriculum, which can be quite interesting. So we've tried to target our presentation quite broadly, both in terms of general strategies for teaching trade, but also with dealing with current events that are rapidly changing, trade at the moment being one of them. In general, I'm often telling students it's about understanding the general trend, the general movement, moving towards more protection, slowing growth, things like that, rather than knowing the exact tariff rate right now with China. Grace and I were having a good conversation over morning tea regarding that, like what even are the tariff rates, as they seem to constantly be changing. So it's about understanding that general trend rather than needing to know a specific figure. I think the first thing is contextualizing trade within students' background knowledge. If we moved back a few years, trade wasn't something that was particularly in the news constantly. Students might not have thought about it too far beyond having travelled overseas or bought something from overseas, but that's definitely changing in the classroom now. I'm finding even Year 10 commerce students are coming in with quite a lot of background knowledge and fairly strongly formed views around some concepts. But within that, they also bring a lot of misconceptions. Often they might have gotten this information from social media or so on. So misconceptions such as the exporting country, China, is paying the tariffs rather than the US is consumers or businesses are paying the tariffs. Fairly large misconceptions there, which then flow on in terms of how they view protection and free trade and its impacts on the economy. So I found quite quickly myself this year pivoting to have broad conversations, sometimes even a whole lesson where we just defined something like a tariff and free trade, and then built out this discussion about, okay, what is trade? How does it influence our lives? In order to link to concepts that you then later unpack, such as composition of trade, direction of trade, benefits, and disadvantages of free trade and protection. I think posing those general questions, be it a broad conversation, be it, a visible thinking strategy, think, pair, share. You could get very creative with mini whiteboards or, online models, but just starting this discussion and allowing, as a teacher, guiding them towards the key concepts that you'll later develop. So things like asking students, okay, when was the last time you bought something overseas? Or did you travel overseas? A lot might have bought off Temu or Shein. And then suddenly they realize, oh yeah, trade can be good. Items can be cheaper. And you can quite quickly, you might ask them, okay, where's your school uniform from? And then they realize they start building out this idea of the direction of trade. Who do we buy goods from? And that can, second question. And then you can ask them, why did you buy it from overseas rather than locally? Sometimes they don't even realize they're buying it from overseas. But that then leads to that conversation about what are the benefits of trade, particularly in this environment where we've moved from an era that was quite globalized and about free trade and reducing barriers to trade towards this recent resurgence in protection and quite negative talk around trade and imports. I think having that discussion of, oh, it's cheaper or there was a different quality of good is really beneficial. So then bringing it into their context, not beyond just as consumers, but so for example, I teach at a school with some boarders and some of those are farmers. So I was like, okay, does anyone's parents work in an industry that has trade? Turns out someone's parents were beef farmers. Great topical time with, tariffs on beef to link to, for them, the benefits of trade. And it's like, oh, is that impacting your parents' business? How is that impacting it? But then, of course, also discussing what could be some negatives of trade. And this is often something that they have engaged with more considering recent discussions in the media. But I think it's definitely important to kind of gauge where students are sitting, kind of their prior knowledge, but also, and so kind of where to take discussions, but also being very conscious that they may have very strong views on either side. It's always that walking that fine line and presenting both sides of the argument.
So how do we teach trade or get them starting to think? There's a couple of, so I will say in South Australia, trade is actually an optional topic, so we don't have to teach it. but I do have students looking at trade and how things are. And I've actually been using this with my students just for a bit of a way to interact. So if you haven't played Tradle, it's like Wordle. You have a number of guesses, and we have to work out what country this is with the information we're given. So even without teaching trade, it actually gets the students thinking about what do different countries produce. So it is like Wordle. It is daily. They do have about 4 or 5 games. They've just introduced a couple of others where you can play against other people or the computer, where you actually have to, you get a series of cards and you have to guess which has the highest export value, and you're playing against the computer. If we can use a range of interactive games and simulations and get the students up and thinking, it is going to be more memorable for them, and they are going to learn from that process. So there are a whole range of different tools out there, a whole lot of different websites out there. There's a number of different websites that teachers can actually get free access to, and they've got instructors' manuals and things like that built into them. Like, online is great, but sometimes getting the students up and walking around is even better. And once again, as I said, not trade, but I use the circular flow simulation, which I've included that document into the resources for you. I actually looked at the product market and the resource market, households and firms, and actually got kids moving around, or students moving around and interacting and seeing how the actual circular flow model worked. Some of these activities, as you know, do take time to prepare. Make sure you set it up, laminate it so you can use it in previous years, in future years. But I did an activity with my students on the business cycle where we're actually using balloons, and I'd set them up into 4 different groups, and they had different group balloons looking at leading, lagging and coincidental indicators, and each group had to blow the balloons up to the size that they thought the indicator was. And then we shared it as a class and to see whether they all agreed. The boom blew the consumer confidence up so much that it did burst. But I had one of my students go, I can actually see that visual representation of the business cycle through the different sizes of the balloons. The interactive activities do help and work.
So another area I think students right now are very keen to engage in is the debates around these issues. They're seeing them in their own lives. And so I think providing a structured opportunity for some of this critical thinking is very valuable. That said, of course, it's important to note you need to have covered that groundwork of theory. I strongly believe that before you can move on to critical thinking, asking students to consider the positive or negative impacts of a tariff can't be done until you have explained methods of protection, arguments for or against protection, benefits of free trade. But I think there's such a valuable place for these activities in getting students to engage on a deeper level and actually bring their own thinking into the issues that they are facing. I have kind of targeted this activity at a year 10 level that can easily be scaled up, and ran it with my own year 10s this term to good results. And it's the idea of, after we've gone through the merits and disadvantages of protection, actually posing to students the idea of, should Australia retaliate against the US by imposing a 10% tariff? And did this with students earlier in the game when all the countries were kind of deciding how they're going to respond to the Liberation Day tariffs. I think at this point, it's largely only Canada and China that we're seeing retaliation from, and even like China's starting to back away and make agreements, which helps support that free trade argument. But getting students to engage with this, like often they came in hearing about these tariffs on Australia saying, oh, well, we should do the same back to them. And then getting to think, well, should we? Why should we? Or why should we maybe not, to illustrate the benefits of free trade? So I think starting with some videos to unpack that background knowledge of the trade wars, particularly in the US and Chinese context, US being kind of the center of where a lot of those tariffs are feeding out of, but then China in terms of understanding its impact on China's economy. Because as Grace explained earlier, it's largely these indirect impacts of that trade war which have a larger impact on us rather than directly US tariffs on us. There is a great video there. It's about 10 minutes on YouTube, but also wanted to flag the most recent current economic conditions video from the RBA in May. Had a really great explanation of tariffs and its impacts on Australia. So that's also a really good resource for students. And then start with these guided questions based on the level of your students and also how they tend to work either as a class or individually, but starting with clear definitions. What's a tariff? What's a trade deficit? Because that comes up in the justification for those US tariffs. Explain the impact of a tariff on imports of an economy. Now, depending on your syllabi, that may include drawing a tariff diagram and unpacking it using P's and Q's, or that could just be in general terms, also depending on the year level you're dealing with. And then this is somewhat of a challenging one. I even got AI to try this one. Create a timeline of key tariff events, because I think it gets students to realize how volatile all of this has been, but also to understand it's at the end of the day, it's about understanding the general trend of what's going on. Because there's a lot of things announced, whether they always go through to fruition. And then the US's aim of implementing those tariffs on imports. That way we're linking back to the concept of trade deficit, how tariffs work, reducing that trade deficit, and then starting to differentiate what are those impacts on the global economy. There's some good World Bank, IMF estimates coming out around slowing growth and what it could mean for different economies. And then the possible impacts of that, both directly on the Australian economy, and they're highlighting actually US trade with Australia is only about 5%, but some sectors like beef, the US is the main exporter. So my student whose dad was a farmer in the beef industry, large impact on whether he expands his beef farm or switches to a different source of livestock. Whereas in other industries, not so much of an impact directly on Australia, but then also that indirect impact through China, through whether the growth slows, although it's sounding optimistic in terms of maybe fiscal stimulus offsetting that. And then once they've got this background on the impacts, argument and its impact on Australia, proposing an argument both for and against retaliating against that US tariff with an Australian tariff on US imports. And then whether you then take this into some kind of debate activity where students are justifying for and against, a paragraph writing activity. I got mine to submit a paragraph after a bit of a broad discussion in class. You can then take however you get students to present it. But also obviously linking to real world examples. I think my students that after reading the statements on monetary policy, they know Trump, a bit of a synonym for uncertainty. So say Trump uncertainty. But then in terms of incorporating it into an essay paragraph, if tariff diagrams are something you do teach, this is a bit of a model. I think it's a great opportunity to build that skill. So, define your paragraph, draw the diagram showing a rise in tariffs. And I think that's interesting because usually we're talking about lowering tariffs and that impact on the country. So it's an important step in getting students to flip their thinking about, okay, what if it goes up? Explaining that impact, referencing the diagram. I think students often skip that step or do it very briefly. And then linking it to illustrative examples on Australia's economy. So generously from a student, they agreed to let me provide you a sample today. I think she was quite honoured. But this is from an essay under timed conditions this year. She didn't know what she was writing an essay on, so it's by far from perfect. And it doesn't start off with a clear definition of tariffs, but I believe she'd done that earlier in the essay. She'd built an understanding of what that was. So I know student samples are helpful. So you can see here, she provides some context. She draws the diagram showing a rise in prices to the P tariff, and then that kind of expansion in supply domestically, contraction in demand domestically, reduction in imports. And then links that to the impact on both China's economy, Australia's economy through some various examples. So that is in your little pack if it is of use.
Using media is something that doesn't matter what topic we do. We know as economics teachers that every year we have to redesign, recreate, readjust what we know the world to be because the economy is changing. So just sort of a generalised way of looking at what what we might look at from in a media article, whether you're identifying that trade topic. So this could be you or the students doing this. So I'll at times actually get the students to find an article, give them a bit of a scaffold looking at these aspects and then double check it for them. But I'm trying to get them to do some reading because I know that at times the ability for students to sit down and read doesn't happen at home. So if I can try and get them doing a little bit in the classroom, it's a win. But getting them to or providing examples of articles that do have trade in it or do have whatever concept I'm looking at, actually getting them to find the economic concepts and theories throughout that article. I'm a believer, I'd print out the article and my holiday homework for one of my classes was to buy 2 highlighters so that they could actually read the articles and go through. And I know that different curriculum also look at not only looking at what the issue is, but finding the solution. So having them have a broad understanding of what they are, looking at the impacts and consequences, but I'd almost go into an extension of what are the possible solutions that the government or what type of monetary policy should the RBA or the central bank implement in the economy at this point in time with that article that they've read. So currently, I don't know whether you are aware, but there was a Four Corners episode called Trading Chaos. It looked at both the American perspective of actual American consumers and households, and as well as the trade issues. Now, some schools are fortunate and have access to ClickView. Do have a look at what is on ClickView. They do have, so Trading in Chaos was on ClickView when I looked, but different resources actually have interactive activities. So they might have transcripts and they might have teaching resources there already for you. Then in the classroom, this is something that I do with the students with the article. I teach at an all-boys school and so a bit of competition is always a little bit healthy. So I was teaching the business cycle at the time and looking at indicators and looking at getting them to actually try and predict and forecast what the economy was at, like what stage of the business cycle and where's it likely to go with the information they were provided. Once again, this is where the highlighters come in. I got them to highlight any leading indicator, highlight any coincidental indicator, and I tried to give them a bit of a time frame to make it a little bit competitive. Then we looked at what are the areas of the circular flow model that are actually mentioned, and in this monetary policy here, there's once again, the link to the video that Chantal was talking about is actually in one of the resources later on. But I've also included the PDF of this statement of monetary policy because it does go into some of those trade aspects. So it brought in that circular flow model quite well, looking at those exports and imports and the uncertainties and things. What are trade tariffs and how do they work? I thought, yeah, let's find an article that I can actually use for this presentation. Great article, but it was more the economic theory. So once again, it was sort of to support textbooks or other things. So that was a better article for doing that rather than actually working out what was happening in the real world. But once again, you can sort of see how I've started going through and highlighting key aspects. So how do we get our students thinking in the classroom? So there is a range of tools there that I've sort of written, but one of the ways that I suppose I introduce topics in class is that conceptual mapping or mind maps. And I introduce a topic and go, look, this is a topic we're talking about. What do you know about it? So it's trying to get their pre-knowledge or pre-testing done. The way the students go depends on the topic, depends on whether they've studied it in previous year levels or not. But one way I've found across the years that I have been teaching is using the game of hangman. So not giving the answers, but getting them to try and think. So if we're talking about trade, what is the macroeconomic objective looking at trade? I'd give them the number of letters and get them to guess what it is rather than telling them the answer. So just getting them to think for longer and that way they also remember it more. Debates, which was mentioned, making sure that we can actually have tangible real life case studies where possible is really important. The use of data interpretation, role plays, economic modelling, which I know at times can be hard to find. Looking at different perspectives, I know that in the syllabus we actually have to look at perspectives of the different people, so consumers or households, firms, the government, financial markets and the overseas markets. So we do actually have to look at the intended and unintended consequences in relation to what is happening to those different groups. So having a look at those different perspectives, trying to get guest speakers in if you can, inquiry-based learning and critical reading. So some interactive activities that you can do offline. I've found using chalk. As long as you've got a space in the school that they're happy for you to do it, as long as it's not near an open day, it can work really well. You can see in that picture that we ran out of space, but they had a lot of fun. There's hexagon thinking, and then a tool I used, and this is prior to COVID, I haven't used it since, but using Skittles and M&Ms and getting students to work as a team to create economic models as a revision tool. They got into it and they did enjoy it. Teaching trade, there are some interactive activities, Marginal Revolution University, but they do actually have some interactive activities. So you can see the top one is actually the interactive practice. You can see my model, the US market price, where I've shaded in blue, and I've did this deliberately, but I've shaded what was the consumer or could be the consumer surplus, and then you press submit. And then it will tell you whether you're right or wrong. So it gives students instant feedback in that graphing activity, but it is online and it gives them that opportunity to experiment and learn at their own pace. They can go back and redo it. So that is something or some place to go if you're wanting some of those interactive activities that have it. Once again, the links are all in the slide. Reserve Bank, how can we not mention these? They do have a great range of resources. So with the statement of monetary policy, at the end of that lesson, I actually said to my students, okay, I want you each in pairs pick an economic indicator, and I want you to tell me what it is, what type of indicator it is, what the trend has been over the last however many years, and I want you to predict what is going to happen by the next chart pack. Next chart pack, we get it open up and the students will have a look to see whether they've actually got forecasted correctly or incorrectly, or whether it's sort of borderline. So these are mainly the trade resources, and I've linked to the balance of payments and external position chart pack section. Just be aware that if you are wanting to keep tabs of previous data, when you go to the link, it does automatically update to the latest link. So you may want to download the whole PDF for that month. So then I know that it keeps the data historical, but if you do want to do that little challenging activity, having that previous data for you to have a look at as a teacher can be really useful. And once again, so that is the link to the video that was mentioned. Then, so where Tradle was found, this has only just recently come up. I'm not suggesting to pay for the version, but they did have a tariff simulator. So you're able to look at two countries. So in this case, it's America and China. Top one is looking at export performances from China to America from memory. So it's looking at who the key partners are they're trading with and why they're trading with it on the left. And then on the right is what they're actually trading. So it's looking at the imports and exports from different perspectives, and it is that visual. Then we've got the Australian Government Department of Foreign Defence and Trade, and they do have snapshots of different countries that we trade with and a whole lot of resources there. And this is where I've got the link to the United States and China in here. But if you look at the actual country or where they sit in our exporting partners, it will actually tell you where they are. You can see that through these fact sheets, the United States doesn't have that direct trade that we think we kind of have in comparison to the other countries. So China is our biggest trade or is one of our bigger trading partners. So you could get students to actually investigate the different countries and maybe create a who do we trade the most with to who do we trade least with sort of line of students in the class.